Right, I'd like to start with a bit of a question just to get us thinking. So let me just get my slides moving. Here we go. I'd like you to have a think about these, the teams behind these organisational disasters and what they might have in common. So we've got the Challenger space shuttle explosion, caused by a decision to launch despite engineers warning about faulty O-rings. The dramatic downfall of BlackBerry, a company that underestimated the rise of the touchscreen smartphone. The Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008, triggered by these unchecked risky investments, and then the subsequent global financial crisis, which I'm sure many of you will remember. Kodak, who actually invented the first digital camera, but they chose to stay focused on film. And Volkswagen, I didn't know about this one until I did my research, fined 30 billion for cheating emissions tests due to a culture where no one challenged unethical decisions. And lastly, Blockbuster, the last one, just closed up the road from Glenfield, I'm sure not that long ago. They basically failed to embrace streaming. So what do you think they might have in common? Maybe just put your answers in the chat. What would the teams have in common? Poor leadership, that's a good one. Anything else? What was it about the leadership, maybe?
Not listening to those on the ground.
Yeah, not listening to those on the ground. I don't know if they were all men. I don't think they were all men, but it's sort of getting in the direction around diversity of the team. Well, I'll tell you the answer. When you do look into the reports on each of these disasters, the theme is that they're fundamentally linked to a lack of cognitive diversity in the teams, or a lack of inclusion of any divergent thinking that was offered. So decisions were effectively made by groups that thought too similarly, and they lacked diverse viewpoints. So they got trapped by groupthink, and they had these blind spots, things they weren't seeing. And obviously that all came at a significant cost to the companies involved. And actually the academic evidence tells us that diverse teams outperform homogenous teams on, particularly on complex tasks. So in other words, teams with all sorts of different perspectives and different ways of thinking are better overall than those made up of all the same kind of brain. And neurodiversity is a really key component of cognitive diversity. Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Turner. I'm just trying to click through. There we go. My name is Jenny Turner, and I'm obsessed with the science of human performance and how different brains think and how we can create these team environments where everyone can reach their full potential, both individually, but also collectively in teams. I'm a neurodiversity and leadership consultant and a coach, and through my company, Human Fabric, I support organisations and individuals to understand, embrace, and harness neurodiversity. Today, you're going to learn what neurodiversity is, the benefits of embracing it in the workplace, the challenges and strengths that neurodivergent people have and what their experiences are, and how you as business leaders can create more neuro-inclusive organisations and teams. And as I said, as some of you were joining, I've sort of tweaked the content to be more about that kind of management and team aspect as opposed to the sort of large-scale organisational setting. So hopefully it'll be really relevant for you today. First, I'd just like to share with you a little bit about my story, as it might help to kind of reframe your thinking about neurodiversity in the workplace. Most of my 23-year career has been in professional services. I've been leading teams and managing projects and leading business change initiatives. I actually started out in environmental science, and I travelled to the far corners of the world, Senegal, Canada, the Arctic. This is me in Papua New Guinea. And I worked with some really diverse groups of people. And in hindsight, it was a crash course in inclusive leadership. Back in New Zealand, I transitioned into project management and grew into leading multidisciplinary projects. But I became pretty frustrated at how our industry tends to put technical experts in charge of managing projects and leading teams for the first time without first developing any of their leadership skills. And so I ended up taking on a role which was improving Becca's project management processes, systems, and the learning and development program. So sort of trying to address that exact problem. It's really common across professional services where you have sort of technical experts that are leading teams for the first time without a day in their life of leadership training. I eventually left Becca after 12 years and became, I had become a principal, and I was the head of delivery practice. Last year, I was really proud to graduate with an MBA, a Master's in Business, which felt like an extra achievement because I was also working full-time and parenting 2 neurodivergent children. But perhaps what is not visible to you through that whole story is that I have ADHD, the horribly named Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Who doesn't want a bit of that? Like many parents, I found out about ADHD when I was looking into it because of my children. And like many women with ADHD, I found out because my traits became more pronounced when my hormones started changing in perimenopause. And so I was diagnosed in my 40s and deep dived into reading absolutely everything I could about ADHD and more broadly about neurodiversity. And the more I learned, the more passionate I became about trying to educate people about the topic. I just couldn't believe New Zealand businesses weren't already talking about neurodiversity more, and especially given the prevalence, which you'll hear a bit more about in a moment. And so I left my corporate career and my perfectly comfortable salary and trained as an ADHD coach and started Human Fabric, which now provides these neurodiversity courses and coaching and consulting. And so I hope by sharing some of my sort of insights, my experience today, with you, that I can challenge some of the stigma and misunderstandings that you might have about ADHD and just neurodivergent people in general. So what actually is neurodiversity? So the neurodiversity paradigm is the idea that all human brains are wired differently and that this variation is a natural and valuable part of the diversity of the human race. And that just as we embrace diversity in ethnicity, in gender, and in culture, there are also these differences in how we each think and feel, sense, communicate, how we learn, and how we process information. And that no brain wiring is right or wrong, it's just that some are more common than others, and we call these neurotypical. So neurodivergent people might be autistic, have ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and numerous other conditions that they're born with. And we'll touch on some of those today. They're not broken, they're not less, they're just different. So this whole kind of neurodiversity paradigm invites us to shift from thinking, what's wrong with this brain, to how does this brain work best? Quick poll for you. I'll get you to pop in the chat, pop in the chat because I can't see all your faces. The number that represents the percentage of people in your organisation that you think might be neurodivergent. So this is the percentage. So you've got less than 3, you'd hold up 1 finger or put one in the chat. If you think it's 3 to 5%, you'd put 2 in the chat, and so on, up until 5 would represent greater than 15%. Any thoughts? It's not an exam. Five fingers. We've got a well-educated audience. Yeah, the answer is 5 fingers. Yes, 15 to 20%. So international experts generally agree that 1 in 5 people are likely to be neurodivergent. Dyslexia is actually the most common type, with around 10% of the population with dyslexia. Around 2% of those would have a severe dyslexia. Around 5% of people are thought to have ADHD, and in New Zealand only around 1% of adults are diagnosed at this stage, so we're slowly catching up to that actual prevalence. Dyspraxia, which affects the brain's planning for movement, is present in about 2 to 10% of the population, so a bit of a wider range of estimates there. And autism is about 1 to 3% of the population. I've actually recently read a study which would say 2 to 3% of the population, so I might update that slide actually. But you can see it's very hard to get the numbers, but we're kind of gives you a sense of at least the percentages. So it's often more prevalent than we think. I had no idea that dyslexia was so prevalent until I had ADHD myself and started looking into it. Neurodivergent people, they have a more sort of spiky profile of strengths and challenges than neurotypical people. So think of it like this kind of mixer board. So where there are some neurodivergent strengths that might be dialed up to like a +9 or a +10, but their challenges might be like a -8 or a -9. compared with a neurotypical person, and they might range from like a +5 to -5. Essentially, we've evolved to have different specializations. Our brains have invested in developing some areas, potentially at the expense of others. And each individual is unique, and so the traits will vary from person to person. They're also really contextual in that they vary depending on the environment and the state of the individual as well. So, for example, how well rested they are, things like hormones. In terms of the environment, it might be the physical environment, whether it's noisy, whether it's distracting, there's flashing lights, there's movement. The sort of psychosocial environment, how safe the person feels, how under stress they are. Importantly, I like to point out neurodivergence is not related to intelligence, so the same bell curve of IQ applies. These conditions, these neurodivergent conditions, are neurodevelopmental differences, which means that they affect the brain and the nervous system, and that you are born with these differences. There are differences in brain structure, chemistry, and networks, the way that different parts of the brain communicate. Diagnosis rates are increasing, yes, but not because more people are becoming neurodivergent. The actual prevalence is thought to be stable. The way that these conditions are categorized and diagnosed has broadened since the 1980s. So it encompasses a much wider range of experiences now. We're starting to understand what these conditions look like in adults who have learned from society to sort of mask and conform a bit more, what it looks like in women. And so sort of the broadening of the definitions is probably catching a few more people within the definitions and being diagnosed. And the scientific community's understanding has changed too, with the increased ability to study the brain, particularly in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But I think the biggest cause for this increasing diagnosis is just greater awareness, greater recognition and acceptance of neurodivergence. In fact, this graph I'm going to show you now really sort of paints the picture. So these are the Google search trends in New Zealand and globally, and it shows that the interest in the term neurodiversity is starting to sort of pick up from about 2015 internationally, and in New Zealand from about 2020. And so we are about 5 years behind the rest of the world. I'd suggest we're about 10 years behind the UK in our work around neurodiversity in the workplace and the way that we sort of culturally think about neurodiversity. But it's really starting to catch up in New Zealand, and you can see this in the search trends for other things like autism and ADHD as well. So this means it's increasingly becoming something important for leaders to understand as well. Which leads us really to the benefits of embracing neurodiversity in the workplace. I'd like you to have a think about why embracing neurodiversity might be relevant at your workplace. Now, I appreciate some of you are solopreneurs, so your workplace might not be as big as some of the others, but perhaps you could answer imagining for workplaces in general. I'll just get you to pop in the chat, what are some of the reasons why it might be important for workplaces to understand and embrace neurodiversity? Doesn't need to be a perfect answer, just a couple of ideas. Any thoughts? Yeah, avoiding expectations that can't be met. Yep. To understand how people learn. Yes. Support our workforce. People might need more time to do things. It's morally right. Yep. In-depth skills. That's, yeah, all great thoughts there. Okay, let me get into the answers. So why embrace neurodiversity in the workplace? We've got sort of three groups of reasons, and we'll just walk through these now. We've got the ethical case, the business case, and the future case. So the ethical case, this is where the sort of moral side of things comes in. There's clearly a basic human equity element here. But what you might not realise is that neurodivergent people are also at higher risk of burnout, anxiety, and depression, not because of their neurotypes, not because of their brain wiring, but it's because of this pressure to fit into environments that are just not designed for them, for a society that's not really welcoming of difference. A 2024 study in the UK showed that 70% of neurodivergent professionals chose not to disclose their differences in the workplace. In New Zealand, I'd suggest that this would be higher. It would be around 95%, I would suggest, but we don't have any data to say that, to know that. And actually, a survey came out in March of this year, which showed that 93% of neurodivergent employees, this is in the UK again, had experienced burnout at some point in their career, and 40% had left their profession due to it. And you could say that I am one of those. I have experienced significant burnout in my career, in my senior years, in my last few years at Becca, and I have left the profession and chosen to focus on educating people around neurodiversity accordingly. Now, there are probably a number of contributing factors to that, so we won't go into that now. But I do think if your workplace is wanting to improve employee well-being and reduce burnout, improve mental health, this has to be part of the conversation. When you've got 20% of your workforce that are kind of feeling othered, that are feeling different, and maybe aren't having their needs met, this has got to be part of the solution. It isn't just the right thing to do, though. Neuroinclusion benefits organisations too. People with ADHD and autism, dyslexia, and these other neurotypes, they often bring strengths, as Dan highlighted in the chat, strengths like pattern recognition, the ability to hyperfocus, big picture thinking, and these talents align strongly with the skills most needed in the future of work. It's quite uncanny, actually, how much they align. The World Economic Forum put out a report again in January of this year, and it's sort of like a list of all of the strengths of neurodivergent people. So that's fantastic. Research also shows that teams with neurodivergent thinkers are more innovative and better at problem solving. And we sort of heard that at the beginning, that cognitive diversity leads to better decision making, less risk of groupthink, and actually neurodiverse teams are more productive. So when I say neurodiverse teams, I mean teams that have both neurodivergent and neurotypical thinkers together. So they've got a variety of brains. When Hewlett-Packard piloted neurodivergent hiring, they reported a 30% boost in productivity in these neurodiverse teams. And similarly, Ernst & Young reported 20 to 40% improvement, and these are the metrics, in productivity, quality, and timeliness in their neurodiverse teams, so teams with all sorts of brains. So that's pretty cool. Interestingly, the investing in neuroinclusion doesn't just benefit the employees being supported. So managers who learn these inclusive leadership techniques also become better at coaching and communicating and tailoring support for all employees. You know, for other people that are that needs additional support, that maybe they've immigrated from another country, they've come from a different industry. So you get these better leadership skills overall. Also, neuroinclusion improves psychological safety and employee engagement for everyone. When other people see that you can fit in, you know, that all sorts of different sort of people can fit in around here, they feel more relaxed to be themselves as well. Microsoft reported a 12% increase in employee retention when they invested in neuroinclusion across the company. So the numbers back that up too. And then there's the future case. So this is kind of the last of the reasons. I find this one really interesting. The younger generations are more open about their neurodivergence, and they expect inclusion. They don't tolerate outdated cultures. You know, in my generation and more senior, you sort of came to work and you expected to be a certain way. You know, you kind of came with your professional attire and you acted like a professional should. And that's really changing with the younger generations. And neurodiversity is part of this. They're very open about it. And so if you want to attract and retain future talent, you need to show that you are neuro-inclusive, that you're welcoming and you understand these differences. So many New Zealand companies are onto this idea already. Here's just a few of them that I'm aware of that are doing some great work in this area. And I find myself having to update the slide just about every time I do this presentation, so every week or so. Because they're increasingly more and more. So it feels like it's quite a sort of movement at the moment. If your name is not up there and you'd like it to be, or you'd like to chat to me about this, then please do get in touch after the call. So we've got all these great benefits to be gained, but what's the first step in creating a neuro-inclusive workplace? Well, I think the first step is kind of understanding what are the strengths and what are the challenges, and what the needs might be. So to do this, I'm going to introduce you to a few characters. So first of all, we've got Ryan. Ryan is a senior sales manager. He is the kind of person who can walk into a client pitch and turn a complex technical solution into a compelling story that wins the room. He's articulate, intuitive, he sees the big picture, and he has this incredible ability to see things like in 3D, this kind of spatial visualization in his mind. But what most people don't see is that Ryan is dyslexic. So dyslexia is a neurological difference that affects reading, writing, spelling, and the sequencing of letters and words, and also working memory. Essentially, it affects how the brain processes written language. At school, Ryan was told he was bright, but slow. He always had these ideas, but he struggled to get them out on paper. His teachers assumed he wasn't trying hard enough, and so over time he learned to mask and hide his struggles, or to work harder and overcompensate. And that coping pattern has followed him into his adulthood. At work, he struggles with the detailed reports that he has to prepare each month, and also reading this huge volume of reports from others. He often stays late to finish what takes others half the time. In fact, he once asked for a text-to-speech tool which would help him process the reports more efficiently. But IT said no because it wasn't on the standard software list. It's really common. But Ryan feels embarrassed about asking again. He doesn't want to seem difficult, so he just stays quiet and he just keeps compensating effectively. And yet with the right adjustments, like some of the very capable assistive technologies available today, or maybe being able to present his updates verbally or in a more visual, kind of punchy format, maybe a PowerPoint, something like that, Ryan could be using his energy on the things he's really good at. Now, Kajal. Kajal is a cybersecurity specialist, and she is brilliant at what she does. Her brain is wired to detect patterns, inconsistencies, and all these sort of subtle changes that others might miss. She's prevented several major cybersecurity attacks on the organisation. She's loyal, she's diligent, she's really focused, she's honest and incredibly competent, and she's also autistic. Autism is also a neurodevelopmental condition, and it affects social communication, sensory processing, and cognitive flexibility. It often comes with this unique ability to have this sort of deep focus, specialist interests and great knowledge in things that are of great interest, and strong pattern recognition. Autistic people experience the world with their senses dialed up significantly more than neurotypical people. You know, imagine walking around and having all of your senses, taste and smell and I'm forgetting what the 5 senses are, all of your senses dialed up. And so you're picking up everything that goes on around you, which can be both a blessing and a curse at different times. Kajal hasn't told her manager that she's autistic. She's worried about how it might affect her career or how people perceive her. She already feels like an outsider. You know, the bright lights and all the kind of constant hum and noise in the office leave her feeling really overstimulated by the end of the day. The social expectations, like this unnecessary banter before meetings and the sort of pressure to make eye contact when you talk to people, which feels really intense, they just don't make sense to her. You know, things like Friday pub trips and a long lunch on Friday, it's not her thing. At school, she was often confused by her peers, and she didn't really understand the unspoken social rules. She was labelled quiet or awkward and sometimes called too blunt. And these labels really echo when she thinks about speaking up about what she actually needs in the workplace. Kajal communicates quite literally, which means she says what she means, and she assumes other people do too. But in the workplace, this is often misinterpreted as abruptness. Her emails are factual, her feedback's quite direct, but when her team doesn't return that same clarity, she feels a bit confused and a bit anxious. What Kajal needs is for people to communicate with her clearly using literal language, to understand that her social style and social preferences are different, they're not less, and she needs a place in the office away from too much noise and stimulation. And she needs to have a routine and a bit of time to get used to changes. She likes the structure and routine to kind of keep her organised. What if Kajal didn't have to mask to fit in? What if she could actually communicate her needs and we could get the best of those exceptional strengths that she brings? What if we could change the environment and not expect to change the person? Lastly, there's me with my ADHD traits. So I thought I'd share a little bit about what it's like to have ADHD through my own lens. So in terms of strengths, clients I've worked with and the teams I've led over the years seem to really resonate with my passion and charisma and high energy. My heightened emotional sensitivity with ADHD means I'm quite attuned to other people's feelings, which can make me quite an empathetic leader. My brain works really quickly, 1,000 thoughts going through my mind. I'm full of ideas and quite insightful. And I have this ability, it seems, to make connections that other people don't see. When I'm into something, I can hyper-focus on it for hours on end and get done, 3 times the work of others for that particular period. I love variety and change, and I'm great in a crisis or under pressure. But ADHD affects executive function. So these are the things that control your ability to get started on things, to maintain focus, to regulate emotions, and to monitor yourself in the moment. Essentially, we have this brain wired for interest, not for importance. We're kind of dopamine seeking. Through our lives, ADHDers tend to experience a lot of criticism for things like misplacing belongings or forgetting things or procrastination or interrupting others, maybe blurting out ideas. And all that criticism does take a toll over time. I've spent a lot of my career subconsciously masking myself, trying to sort of dial down the energy and passion that I have to meet what I thought a professional consultant should act like. Even as a senior leader, I often felt misunderstood. Sometimes my passionate delivery was taken for aggression. My curiosity and this sort of quest for continual improvement was sometimes considered a bit disruptive. And I remember one time after some feedback, I remember saying, I feel like you're trying to squeeze the Jenny out of Jenny. And ADHD itself does bring a number of challenges too. It can be quite a confusing experience before you understand your brain and how it, what it needs. My working memory is quite impacted, so it makes it hard to hold information in the short term. Sometimes I forget what I'm talking about with somebody mid-sentence. Tends to not happen in these conversations because there's the adrenaline pumping, right? I forget anything that I haven't got written down. People used to mock me for having lists and spreadsheets for everything. And I've always wondered how everyone else gets by without such systems. I have to have lists for everything. If a task feels boring to me, I just maintaining focus on it can feel quite impossible. And I struggle with the open plan office with all of the, the conversations and the movement and, even people walking up and down the hallway would kind of break my flow. It's like my brain is kind of a bit like the autistic folks is picking up all of these changes in the environment and not focusing on the thing in front of me on my computer screen. I work better in these, quiet spaces or maybe later at night when everyone else is not there. But when I would do that, if I would turn up at work at 10 o'clock the next day, I would feel the judgment from those that work more regular hours, So I'm kind of like a sprinter. I can run incredibly fast, but not forever. And I need to rest before the next sprint or I burn out. You can't sprint forever. My brain just runs on a different rhythm and I need a bit of flexibility to be able to work with it. I thrive with strong work management systems in place. So, when I've got clear goals, clear expectations, really clear deadlines, but also with a bit of contingency built in and having frequent short check-ins with my manager. And probably the thing I need most from others is just understanding and acceptance of my differences. So that's ADHD through my lens. So that was a bit of a deep dive into 3 of the traits, but please do remember individual experiences may vary, will vary, and there'll be people on the call today that are neurodivergent themselves that are thinking, oh, well, I resonate with some of that, but not all of that. My experience is different. There's also a whole lot more conditions under what they call the neurodivergent umbrella. But the really interesting thing is that they often coexist. For example, 60% of people with autism will also have ADHD. And so you don't need to become an expert in any one of these individual conditions. You just need to know as a leader that each individual is different, and that if we design our workplaces to be inclusive of all types of brains, and then we build in a bit of flexibility to meet the individual needs, we'll be able to harness the potential of all of these unique minds. Okay, so what can you practically do to harness neurodiversity? This is the part where I thought I would focus on what managers and colleagues can do, as opposed to the sort of higher level organisational design. There's a lot of overlap between them, but I think this will be most relevant for this audience. I think that the manager level, managers and colleagues level is so important because they create these kind of culture bubbles. So even when the organisation has these, the perfect policies in place, I think real culture is shaped at the team level. So I've got 8 areas of neuro-inclusive practices to highlight for you today. I do a much longer format of this. We do a 4-hour workshop where we actually go through and practice all of these different things and sort of talk about practical things. But what I do today in the remaining sort of maybe 20 minutes or so is just go through kind of a quick snippet of each one of the eight things. So hopefully you'll get some pieces of advice to take away. Okay, so the first thing, we're already doing this today, is just understanding and embracing differences, appreciating that not everyone thinks the same way as you do, and not everyone will work the same way as you do. From a neurodiversity perspective, I'd just like to highlight the differences in those sensory and emotional sensitivities. And so being aware that just because you can work in the office with the radio playing doesn't mean that the next person can. And if they say that they're struggling to focus because of it, believe them, because they're communicating and trying to do their best in the workplace. Also different emotional sensitivities. I'll give you some advice in a moment around how to give feedback more effectively when particularly ADHDers tend to be quite reactive to negative feedback. They feel criticism like pain, The next one is fostering psychological safety. A couple of sort of tips here. I actually would actively ask for dissenting views in a meeting. So particularly important if you're more senior or if you are the manager of that person or of the people in the meeting, actually go around the room and say, what other views do we have? It's like asking, making it okay, making it safe to have a different view. That goes a long way to fostering psychological safety. You can see on each of these slides, I've got kind of all the points laid out, but I'm just highlighting like 1 or 2 that in the conversation. Modeling vulnerability is the other thing to highlight here. So, making it okay to have not perfect days, making it okay to show your sort of whole self in the workplace. Now, if you're a neurotypical leader, that might mean recognizing that you're struggling with challenges with your children, or that you've had a frustrating morning or something like that. But it's basically showing a little bit more of yourself and making it okay to communicate that you have needs as well. And it makes it safer then for those that are neurodivergent to be able to communicate what their needs might be to their manager, because you're modeling it. Let's talk about strengths and support. So amplifying strengths and mitigating challenges. So Don Clifton, who's the father of the strengths-based psychology, and he also invented that Clifton Strengths Finder, he says that we will excel only by maximizing our strengths, never by fixing our weaknesses. But if you think about most of the performance conversations, those sort of, the annual performance improvement review, it's often about, well, you need to pick up this and you need to pick up this a bit and you need to kind of do a bit more of this. And so this is about understanding that if we lean into our strengths and try to master our strengths while still kind of trying to catch up or mitigate some of the challenge areas in some way, we will get a lot further. So sometimes as a leader, what you can do is help people to understand what these strengths are. It takes a while in your career before it becomes clear to you what your strengths are. So that's something that I would recommend. and then get them to communicate them with each other, not just with the manager, but I would start every team. I worked on a lot of project teams. I would start every team by having everyone share what are the strengths that they bring to this particular endeavor, and their strengths might be, sort of skills that they have learned. I'm a hydrogeologist, I'm a whatever, but it might also be I'm an out of the box thinker, or I have tenacity to keep going and sort of lift the team up when things get tough, that kind of thing. There might be those sort of strengths. In terms of accommodations, I should just mention here that accommodations are things that you can offer all employees to help them be their best selves in the workplace, and it's particularly important for those that are neurodivergent or disabled in some way where they have a need. We recommend organisations have a centralised budget for this, so that it doesn't become a big drama when someone says, I would really like, Ryan needed the IT software to have speech to text, which was going to cost $50 or something, and it just wasn't on the standard list, and then no one knows what to do with it because there's no process around it, so if you have a kind of centralized process through maybe the HR leader around this and the budget centralized, it takes away a lot of that, and it can be based on whether it's a reasonable request for this individual. And many of these things are solved with free accommodation, so free things like changes in the way that you communicate the work to be done, or flexibility in working from home some days of the week, or offsetting your hours, that sort of thing. So it sort of ties in with a flexible work policy as well. Adapting leadership to the individual. So this means rather than thinking about what's your leadership style, what is the leadership that you want to be, it's actually thinking about what is the leadership technique that this person needs today on this task. And it might be different later in the day when they work on a different sort of task. So that's called situational leadership, adapting your leadership style to the needs of the individual. And that requires a bit of a mindset shift, because for many years, many decades actually, we've talked about, what is the best leadership style? What's the most effective leadership style? Well, it's all a load of rubbish, because you actually need to know a whole bunch of leadership styles so that you've got a sort of toolkit of different leadership techniques to bring out at different times. Short, frequent check-ins is another thing I'd like to call out here. So rather than sort of having a 6-weekly catch-up or even a weekly catch-up, having a 15-minute check-in, and you can still take a kind of coaching approach to this, like, how have you gone, kind of like a stand-up, but a one-on-one. How did yesterday go? What new things came up? What are your priorities for today? You can take a sort of coaching, questioning approach. It doesn't have to be a kind of micromanagement approach. But that can help to keep people on track and feel reassured that they're on track. And then feedback. This is a model that I have taken and modified to be more neuro-inclusive. So I really like this model. I find it quite effective myself when I'm receiving feedback. And as a leader, I've used it for 5 years. I would literally write out this before I had a feedback conversation. So I'll just go through it for you. So the situation is you describe the context of the feedback you're about to give. So you might say, Jenny, in this meeting. Then you describe the action the person took. So Jenny, in this meeting, when you said XYZ, you then describe the impact that it had. And you might, this is where often the individual goes, oh God, that wasn't the impact I was hoping for, right? So you're helping to point out, Jenny, in this meeting, when you said XYZ, what happened was you lost Bob. He tuned out. I saw him tune out after that. And so we weren't able to kind of get the key points across. And then you might describe what you would do differently. So what is it with your wise, leadership background you would recommend that person do differently? The thing that's different from the regular SAID model, SAID, is that I think it's useful to acknowledge the difference of this individual. So you might say, I appreciate that this is challenging for you because you were having to think on your feet in this, if that's something that's difficult for them. So it's actually acknowledging that you understand them, because many of the things we're having to give feedback on, they might feel like you're asking them to do something that is not aligned with the way their brain works. But it's actually, in order to be effective and have the outcomes they're seeking, you're going to need to sometimes provide feedback in this way. So this is a way to do it and acknowledge the difference. And it's about making it about the behavior and the impact of the behavior, and not about the person and the personality, right? So you're not saying, Jenny, you are wrong. Jenny, you are bad. You're saying, Jenny, your action isn't having the impact that you're hoping for, which sits a lot better with me, you know? Okay, communications, the whole raft of things related to communication for neurodivergent people. Here's some just to call out. So clear, direct, literal, and specific expectations. I like to use the phrase, what by when? You know, so when you're asking someone to do something, just think about how clearly you are articulating it. Avoid the use of phrases that actually don't mean anything when you take them literally. And there's a lot of them in the English language. We go through in the people leaders course and actually like call out what some of them are in each organisation. And gosh, there's some funny ones out there. Provide clear deadlines, but with contingency. So something my manager did that really helped me was we would, if something was due by Friday, we would have an interim deadline on the Wednesday where I had to show them where I'd got to. And just the fact that I knew that I had to show somebody, another human, my progress meant that I was activated to get the thing done. So we had this kind of interim deadline, but it was sort of it was safer to fail that deadline than it was to fail the actual deadline, which was submitting a presentation to the board pack. And if you miss it, you have to wait another 6 weeks. Visual communication methods work with many neurodivergent people. So think things like, whiteboarding. If you're having a conversation, stand up in front of the whiteboard or the online equivalent of that. Using infographics. If you're having a team meeting and you're going around the room and discussing what everyone's doing, have some sort of a tracking thing, some sort of a Gantt chart or a Asana or Monday.com or any one of those sort of quite visual displays of the tracking of progress that can kind of supplement what is being said orally. So any kind of visual communication is helpful. And lastly, for those that are dyslexic, there are some accessibility guidelines that help for both dyslexia and those that are low vision. And they include things like using Arial and sans serif fonts. So things like not the Times New Roman, the fonts with all the extra curly whirly bits, basically make it harder to see. Left aligned, not doing center aligned, which yeah, I've gone through and changed this presentation. There must be an older version because it's got the center. What else? 1.25 line spacing as opposed to 1 point line spacing. Yeah, there's a number of other things, and I'll give you a resources page at the end, which you can download those dyslexia guidelines. But yeah, really useful to know. And I had no idea before this, and I had been doing global, communications across 4,000 staff globally in Asia Pacific at least, and probably breaking lots of those rules because I had no idea. Okay, number 6, so tailoring ways of working. So a little bit like the strengths conversation, asking everyone how they work best. I would go around before I started a project as well, and I would ask everyone to share with each other, how do they like to receive feedback? How do they like to receive the work to be done? What do they want us to know about how they work best? Do they do their deep work in the morning, deep focus work in the morning, and they do the kind of more kind of broken up interactive stuff in the afternoon? Do they need processing time? So somebody, some people that I work with, I need to give them the information and then I need to give them some time, and then we need to have a conversation about it, but they can't engage with it at the same time as they get the information. Respecting different work paces and environments and breaks. I used to kind of slightly roll my eyes at people who would go and take a 1-hour lunch break, but they were probably having a very healthy kind of work day and managing their energy through the day, whereas I would bust on through because I was always afraid to stop. And this is, now I understand, such an ADHD thing where it's so hard to start. Once I start, I don't want to stop because I'm afraid I won't start again, So I would just kind of keep working, and I would eat lunch at my desk. And but actually recognizing that different people work in different ways, and generally people know what works best for them. So as a leader, respecting that rather than trying to sort of be heavy-handed about how we're going to do things here. So flexible working absolutely comes into play here, and take a growth mindset and experiment with different ways of working in teams, because each new combination of people and different types of brains in a team might require slightly different ways of working collectively to get the best from everyone. Meetings is kind of a subset of that last one. It's quite a big aspect of our lives in most workplaces. So sharing agendas and information in advance that allows people to actually digest and to have clarity around what's expected. Little technique I really like is the power start. So this is about sort of setting the P as the purpose of the meeting, the O is the outcome sought. So what are we trying to achieve in the meeting? So what does good look like by the end of the meeting? The W is the what's in it for me. So in other words, why is this person at the meeting? What role are they playing? What hat are they wearing? What sort of contributions might they make? E is engagement. So how do you want people to engage? Is this a meeting where people are going to sort of chip in as we go, or are we going to go around the room and everyone's going to have their say? How's it going to work? And the last one is the meeting roles. So who's going to chair the discussion? Who's going to manage the time? Who's going to take the notes, which is AI now, so that's easy. Yes. So what else? Thinking time. I worked with somebody who was autistic for a long time, and we used to have this thing where we would have a meeting, we would, kind of bring the information to be discussed, we would have a chat about it, and we would just make a decision. And she was reasonably quiet through the meeting. And then she would go away, and if it was something significant, she would sort of 4 hours later send me this email, which would be pages long, and with all of her thoughts, and maybe a different recommendation. And I would get really frustrated. Like, why didn't you bring this up during the meeting? Why would you send this afterwards? And one point it all came to a head, and we had a conversation about it. And she said, I just need thinking time. I just need time to kind of process before, in order to kind of gather my thoughts and therefore share them. And she had some really great insights. And so what we changed was we would have the information sharing meeting, and then we would have a day or two, and then we would have the decision meeting, and that worked really well for all of us. So just little tweaks like that. I love it when people follow up with a written summary after the meeting, and there's no reason not to do this now with AI being able to summarize our meetings really well and clear actions. Okay, we're nearly there, folks. Recruitment. So I want to touch on recruitment. So probably the biggest thing to take away here is culture add, not culture fit. Don't think about hiring because you're trying to fit someone into your team. You're trying to add someone to your team who is going to complement. I'm going to sneeze, hold on. I've got a cold. Terrible time for a sneeze. There we go. So you're looking for someone who's going to complement the ways of thinking and the strengths of the existing team, not someone who's going to be just like you. And be really conscious of that, because our human nature is to presume more competence in the people that are more like us. That's called unconscious bias. There's some great online courses you can do on unconscious bias. If you just even Google it, you'll find some useful stuff. You can watch a 5-minute video and it can be very eye-opening very quickly. Just also think about when you are recruiting the job, the interview process, what it's actually testing for. So, the traditional interview process tests for your ability to articulate answers to questions on the spot, drawing from a range of experience in front of a group of people. So it's like quick thinking, on your feet communication skills. But if you're hiring a really technical role, is that what you want to measure, or do you want to measure their technical skills? And how could you do that? Maybe it's through a different approach, because many, particularly autistic people, struggle to even get through the interview process to get in the door, because of the biases, these unconscious biases and the biases in the process. Okay, so many of today's management approaches originate from this industrial revolution. We've kind of got the Ford era, and it's called scientific management, Taylorism, where it was all about consistency and uniformity and conformity and producing the same widgets out of the factory every time. But the world is changing, and so what we need now, we need that diversity of thought to solve these complex problems. And so when you have kind of organizational processes that are designed for this sort of world of work, but actually we want quite different work outputs now, we need to think about our, the way that we're leading teams and the way that we're setting up our organizations. So if I was to summarize the shift, I think it's something like this: from control and efficiency and standardization and sort of a very compliance focus, very sort of system centered, to more empowerment, flexibility, individualization, and very human centered. So it's more tailored. And that's how we kind of tap into this diversity of the human brains that we have in our workforce, rather than sort of squishing it out of them into this kind of conformity kind of world. So you can see that's the shift we're trying to make. So today, you've learned that neurodiversity is a different way of thinking, feeling, processing, and behaving. That being neurodivergent comes with these strengths, but also with challenges, and that some of these, there are some things in the workplace that might be presenting invisible barriers, maybe things you weren't aware of. But there are many quite simple, low-cost things that you can do to create more neuro-inclusive workplaces, which starts with just awareness and understanding. And as business leaders, you're perfectly placed to lead this change by building the leaders within your organizations and the processes and cultures that can benefit from all types of minds. And as you've heard, your organizations will do better because of it. Just a couple of last slides. If you're interested in finding out more about neurodiversity, please get in touch. I've got a sort of range of services there. So we provide courses, we do coaching for managers, coaching for employees. We have an assessment for organizations and an accreditation coming out very soon. And lastly, if you would like to get the summary takeaway sheet, which has all of those bullets, which I flashed in front of you very quickly, I think you can you click there? When you do it in Teams, you can click there. If you can't, I'll pop it in the chat. And I'm happy to stick around and have questions and discussion about what is quite an interesting and curly subject sometimes.